These are the 7 most common mistakes that I see parents make in the college recruiting process. And for context, I've talked to more than 1,000 parents this year alone. I've helped hundreds of families navigate through college recruiting. And so these are the 7 most common mistakes that I see families make on a daily basis that makes it really hard for them to help their kid get the interest and offers that they're looking for from awesome schools. So the first mistake is trusting your high school travel or club coach to make this recruiting process work for you and get those offers. And so what ends up happening is that a family doesn't really know how to navigate college recruiting, but they get hooked up with some sort of local team or travel team, right? And they think that that coach is going to be able to put them in an amazing recruiting position, most often because the coach says that they're going to be able to help them do that. And so the family goes, awesome, we don't have to do anything. This coach is going to deliver scholarship offers on a golden platter. Amazing. And this almost never happens. And so really what those families end up doing is they do 2 things. The first thing is they rely on that coach to leverage connections for them. They believe that their high school coach or travel coach has connections with college coaches, and they think that the coach is going to leverage those connections for them. Now, that coach might have some connections. It's unlikely they have a lot of them, no matter what they tell you, but they might have some of them. Even if they have some of them, they're not going to make 50 phone calls for you, right? It's just not going to happen. So you're not going to get a lot of exposure from that coach. And the second thing that a lot of families look for from coaches like this that ends up not really turning out well is some sort of strategy. Thinking that a high school coach or a travel coach knows about the recruiting process and can give a solid game plan of how to systematically generate these opportunities. And so many of these coaches don't know how to do that. If they did, they would run a recruiting service, but they don't. They probably run some kind of team where they're putting teams in tournaments and showcases and things like that. And so when you trust a coach who isn't going to go make 50 calls for you and doesn't have the connections they say they do and doesn't have a solid strategy in recruiting, and then you're going to have a hard time getting interest. And so parents get told by these coaches, hey, don't worry about it. I'm going to deliver all of these scholarships for you. Then parents sit back and wait. And what ends up happening is they don't get those opportunities. They waste 12 months or 18 months hoping that that happens. And then they finally reach a breaking point where they go, okay, this is not going to happen with what we're currently doing. We have to take matters into our own hands, which is great. That is the right mode of thinking, except that it's happening 12 to 18 months too late. And the later that you get in the recruiting process, the harder that it gets. And so I see so many families who come to us at, senior year, second semester, senior year, very late in the process. And they go, yeah, I trusted my high school coach or my travel coach. We thought that he was going to deliver all this interest because that's what he or she told us they would do, but it didn't happen. And now we're behind the 8 ball. And so I hope that you can learn from this and get ahead of this. Yeah, I hope that your travel coach connects you with schools. I hope that they give you some sort of game plan in recruiting, but you also need to take matters into your own hands. It's not, should I do this or should I do this? It's you should be doing both. You should be taking the process into your own hands and hoping that your coach is going to deliver a bunch of interest for you. Okay. Second mistake that I see is assuming the kid is going to handle all of the work. So there are old school people in recruiting who will say, if your kid wants it bad enough, they're going to send the emails, they're going to make the videos, they're going to do all of this stuff, right? That is an old school way of thinking. The reason I say that's an old school way is because the recruiting process is very different today than it was even just 5 years ago, but certainly 10, 15, 20 years ago. The people who are saying that are out of touch with today's recruiting process. They don't understand the level of work and the burden that is on these kids' backs, okay? It is a ton. It's a huge weight to bear. And so I can tell you, with families who come in, who end up working with us, there are 2 types of families. There are families where they divvy up the work, and the parent takes on some of the work, and the kid takes on some of the work, and it's sort of a team effort. And then there's families who the parent spends the money, right, to join the program, and then they give it to the kid, and they say, okay, kid, we just paid for this resource. This is us helping you do this. And then they just trust that the kid is now going to use those resources and make this happen, okay? And I'm here to tell you that families who put the entire burden on the family struggle more than families who help each other and make it a team effort. And that's with us, with a lot of support, giving the kid resources to make this easier. Like, that is a huge advantage. And yet it's still challenging. Why? Because the recruiting process is just insane nowadays. And trusting that your 16-year-old who goes to class for 6 hours and then goes to practice and then goes to weights and then has homework to do and tests to study for, comes home, does chores, also is allowed to have a social life because they're a high schooler, and we haven't even talked about recruiting yet. And so assuming that 16-year-old is now going to go make recruiting videos, send emails, post on social media, send DMs, like do all of these other things, that's a lot, even for an adult, for a 30-year-old, 40-year-old, 50-year-old, that's a ton of work. And so assuming that your kid is gonna do all of this work is probably not realistic. And at the same time, just because your kid isn't doing the work doesn't mean they're not motivated or that they don't want it. The system is just set up for those kids to fail. And so if you're watching this as a parent, I highly recommend that you help your kid. You are not being, a burden. You're not being overbearing. You're not, condoning laziness. Like, that's not what you're doing. You're helping them achieve a goal and showing them what it takes. And it is too much work for one person to bear, especially a 16-year-old. If it wasn't, realistically, we wouldn't be in business. If it was that easy, we wouldn't be in business. So very clearly, the process is much harder than it used to be 10, 20, 30 years ago. So I would not put the entire burden of all of this stuff on your kid. Help them out. Give them resources. Give them your time. Literally help them through every step of this process, and you will probably get better results if you help them do that, and you're not being a bad parent by doing that, okay? Third thing, only contacting Division I schools. Third mistake, only contacting Division I schools. I see this often. Even if your kid is a Division I caliber player, you should be contacting schools at every division, or at least 2 or 3 other divisions. Okay. There's a couple different reasons for this. The first is you might be wrong about your kid's talent level. You might think that they are Division I caliber, but you haven't gotten outside of your little bubble. And the minute that you do, you realize that there's a lot of other really good players out there. And so you might be wrong about your kid's talent level. And if you only contact Division I schools and you are wrong, you're going to be in trouble, because you're not going to have any other interest or offers. You're going to be later in the process. It's just going to be a whole lot of pain waiting for you there. And so instead, even if your kid is a Division I level player, it's not going to hurt you to contact other divisions. It's only going to benefit you, because you can still say no. If those other divisions come calling, you can still say no if you get the D1 offers that you were hoping for. And so you should be contacting multiple levels of schools, and there's other reasons to do this as well. For instance, let's say that you only contact Division I schools and you get one response from a school. And you're like, well, we didn't get a ton, but we got one response, and it's your kid's favorite school. It's Stanford or University of Tampa or something like that, right? You're like, this is my kid's favorite school. And I say University of Tampa, by the way, because it feels like every kid wants to go to the University of Tampa right now. So if you're wondering why I put Tampa and Stanford in the same sentence, that's why. But the point is that if you get one school to respond from like Division I, right? Guess what one of the first questions they ask you is going to be? They're going to ask who else you're talking to, because they want to know that they are validated, that other schools also see what they're seeing, that they're a good player. And when your kid responds and says, well, nobody, because you only contacted Division I schools, that coach is going to go, well, why not? If you were a good player, wouldn't you be talking to multiple schools? And now you've just made it significantly harder to build a relationship with your favorite school, and it's unlikely that you're going to get that opportunity and that offer. Whereas if that school says, who else are you talking to? And you contacted other divisions, and so you have 8 other schools, you can say, I'm talking to 8 other schools. You don't even have to say what those schools are, but that's instant validation that you are now talking to other schools, and that process is going to be a lot easier with your favorite school. So there are a lot of different reasons why you should be contacting multiple divisions, not just Division I, even if your kid is a Division I player. I highly recommend doing that. I think it's a huge mistake not to do that, and I see a lot of parents regretting not doing that earlier in the process, it can only help you, and then you can always say no. Okay. Fourth mistake, only contacting 10 to 30 schools, something like that. Standard recruiting advice says you should contact 20 to 30 schools. There's a book out there. I can't remember who writes the book or what the book is called, but there's a common book out there that's going around in recruiting, and the advice in the book is to contact 20 to 30 schools. And I can only assume that this person, one of two things. One, they don't like you and they don't want you to succeed, or two, they have no idea what they're talking about. Because anybody who is sending a legitimate number of emails in college recruiting, I mean tens of thousands of emails, anybody who's doing that will tell you that 20 to 30 schools is not enough. Because guess what? We've sent over 50,000 emails to college coaches just in the last 12 months. And so I can tell you, after looking at all of that data, that you can average about a 10% reply rate. And that is if your kid's a really good player, contacting schools that they are capable of playing at, the video is dialed in, the email script is good, social media is good. If all of those things are perfectly aligned, you can expect a 10% reply rate, which means if you contact 20 to 30 schools, do the math, 2 to 3 responses. And if you're contacting reach schools, which a lot of people are, they put 20 schools on a list. Guess what? 10 of those schools are a kid's favorite schools that they're probably not capable of playing at. So you really only contacted 10 schools, and then a 10% reply rate would be 1 response. And that's where like a lot of people get to, right? And so I'm just telling you, yeah, some families get way more than that. 20, 30, 40, 50 responses. Yeah, it's real if you contact a lot of schools. And so I'm just telling you that the math is not on your side. 20 to 30 is not going to work if you are planning on using email as the primary generator of interest in your recruiting process. Now, if you're going to go use something else like social media, cool, you do you. But if you're expecting email to be the way that you're going to get your kid on college coaches' radars, then you have to actually do it. And this is one of those things I mentioned earlier, that the recruiting process is a lot different now than it was 30 years ago. 30 years ago, you could send 30 emails and you might get 20 responses. Why? Because it was email in the 90s. Like, yeah, even in the 2000s, up to 2010, 2015, you could send 30 emails and get 10, 15, 20 replies. Just not going to happen today. It's just not going to. And so if you're planning on using email to generate interest, I recommend a minimum of 100 schools. That's where we start. We start at 100 schools, and we have families who have sent 300, 400. Guess what? They get more interest. And if you're like, oh my gosh, I don't even know 100 schools, then yeah, that's a solution that you have to find. You have to go get 100 schools. But at least you know the path now. You know the path. You're like, all right, I got to go find 100 schools. And if you're sitting there going, well, I'm not interested in 100 schools. My kid's not interested in 100 schools. I know that. Right? But the idea is that you want to generate as much interest as you possibly can, and then you can filter down from that interest later. You can always say no, but it's very difficult to generate interest just from a small number of selected schools. It's really, really hard to do for a lot of different reasons. And so I would cast a super wide net. I'd contact a whole bunch of schools, and then once you get interest, then you can filter down from those schools and start to get a little pickier. Fifth mistake that I see a lot of parents make is thinking in weeks, not months. So there's a lot of parents who will start taking action in the recruiting process. They make some videos, send some emails, post on social media, do stuff like that. And they'll do it for 2 weeks, and then they won't see results, and they'll say, oh my gosh, this doesn't work. Email doesn't work. Video doesn't work, right? When in reality, it's because it's only been happening for 2 weeks. Now, can you get results in 2 weeks? Yeah, sometimes we see it pretty frequently, actually. But that doesn't mean it's going to happen every time. And a lot of times in recruiting, the process takes months, not weeks. It's very unlikely that a coach is going to watch your kid's video via an email and then 10 seconds later be like, here's a $50,000 scholarship. It's just not going to happen. No one is going to do that unless your kid is a top 5% player in the country. And if that was the case, you're probably not watching this video right now. You're probably trying to barricade your door because coaches are knocking it down. Right? And so the reality is that it's probably going to take many months for this to work. And so if that's the case, you have to have a plan of longevity. You can't just have a plan for the next 2 weeks. You have to have a plan for many months, and not just generate interest, but be able to build interest over time, build relationships with coaches over time. You have to be able to do that. And you have to have the patience to do that, because a lot of parents don't have that patience. They just want the process to be over right away because it's a pain in the butt. I get it. But if you try to rush the process, there's a good chance that you are going to reduce the number of opportunities that your kid is going to end up getting. And so you have to think about the process in terms of many months, be in it for the long haul. And if it ends up taking way less than that, awesome. And if it ends up taking that amount of time, you're going to be totally fine because you anticipated it taking that much time anyway. And so many mistakes happen in the recruiting process from parents trying to speed the process up instead of just being patient. And having unrealistic expectations in the process is super dangerous. It's not just going to take an emotional toll on you, it's going to lead you to make bad decisions. And those bad decisions are going to result in less interest in offers than you were hoping for. So you have to think in terms of months, not weeks. Sixth mistake that I see a lot of parents make is they focus on the wrong things, mainly small things, instead of focusing on the big needle movers that are actually going to change your recruiting process for the better. Here's what I mean. There will be a lot of parents who are like, oh my gosh, my subject line is really important. I'm going to spend an hour and a half trying to write the perfect subject line. And it's like 700 characters long, forgetting that it's going to get cut off anyway in an email. And so there's a lot of parents who are focusing on something like the subject line when that's such a small piece of getting coaches to open your email and of the email process. There's other things that matter way more, where if you got the big things right, your subject line probably doesn't even matter at that point, right? As long as it's good enough. And there's so many examples of this in the recruiting process where parents worry about the smallest details that really don't matter, that don't have any impact on their process. It's sort of like that 80-20 rule, right? What are the 20% of things that make 80% of the results? And a lot of times parents are focusing on the 80% of things that only bring the other 20% of results and are going to make it really hard to succeed. And so it's huge that you focus on the things that are going to drive interest now, that are actually going to make progress, rather than the little tiny things that are fine-tuning details that even if you get those right, if you get the big things wrong, they're not going to matter. Right. And the seventh and last mistake that I see a lot of parents make is what I'm going to call worrying about external factors. So an external factor would be something like the transfer portal, NIL, roster caps. All of those are things that are happening right now in college recruiting that are making it harder to navigate the process. There's no doubt that the process is getting harder to navigate, not easier, right? But here's the thing. Those external factors do not affect your inputs, meaning all of those things that we just talked about don't affect the fact that you should be making videos and sending emails and posting on social media. They affect how you feel about the process. They affect how challenging the process is. They affect how long the process might take you, but they don't change the inputs and behaviors that you should have. And so parents sit there and start worrying about the transfer portal. Oh my gosh, I can't send emails because of the transfer portal. No, you should be. That's an input that you should be doing on a daily basis. The transfer portal just makes it harder, right? It just makes it harder. It's an external factor that should not affect your inputs, your internal behaviors. And so I think a lot of parents, because the recruiting process is emotional, let's not get it wrong. The recruiting process is a very emotional process. Your kid has been working toward this goal for a very long time. You have spent hours and hours and hours on sidelines, taking your kid to lessons and practices and games. You've spent a ton of money. You have a lot wrapped up in this goal and in this process. And that makes it an emotional process, along with the fact that it is your kid, it is your flesh and blood. And so this is an emotional process. There's no denying that. But at the same time, you have to be able to separate the emotions from the actions that you need to take. Because if you only focus on the emotions, you're going to end up not doing any actions because you're going to feel paralyzed. And so instead, you have to be able to separate those two things and act in the face of uncertainty. You need to be able to send emails even when the transfer portal seems like it's making things hard. You need to be able to make videos even when roster caps come out and they're reducing the number of people that can play on a certain roster. You have to be able to take action even amidst things making the process harder, especially when they get emotional. And I think that's one thing that a lot of parents miss, and they focus too much on all these other things that they get to blame. And they get, it's the transfer portal's fault. It's the roster cap's fault. No, if you didn't do anything, to advance your kid's process, then it's not those things' fault. It's your fault, right? And I know that's hard to hear, but you have to take action in the face of uncertainty because that's the only way that you're going to beat those things that are making the process harder. So hopefully these 7 things kind of give you an idea that if you can, solve these problems, then you're going to put yourself in a really good position to succeed in college recruiting. If you're still struggling in the process and you want help, then click the link in the description. There's a link to book a call. We only work with juniors and seniors. But if that's you, schedule a call with us. We'll walk you through how we can help. Otherwise, I will see you guys next time.